Hi everyone. In this tutorial I'm going to go through some of the basics in Enscape rendering, how to get a student license, install it, and then set it up within your Rhino, as well as looking at materiality, assets, and the Enscape user interface. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how do you get a kind of license. Enscape's great because it offers anyone with a student or educator email a free 24 months license, which can be renewed as long as you're a student. And I'll leave these links in the description of the video. So first thing you want to do is using your student email, navigate to this website, get a free license, and just fill out the form, and it will send you an email with your license and an installer. Once you install Enscape, we're going to be using this render Rhino file, and I'll leave a link to the download in the description of this video as well. So once you open up Rhino, nothing's really going to happen. Enscape should be installed, and the way you'll know it's installed is if you right click on this show your toolbars and go show toolbar, navigate to the bottom. You should have an Enscape plugin called section, and we're just going to use this top one, which is the English Enscape. We'll just click there and you'll have this new Enscape toolbar, and we can just put that here. So this is basically what the Enscape toolbar looks like within Rhino. So there's a couple things that we have. We've got just an information which will give you information about your Enscape version. That's just good if you need to update it. There's a kind of feedback or issues. We've got general settings, so this just hardware features, network if you're using a network, which I don't think I will. Your license, so this is where you get your license, and then preferences for language, etc. So those are those three. We can upload views and panoramas to clouds. I'm not going to go too much into that today. We've got our materials, so this is our kind of how we tune materials, which I'll go through later in this tutorial. We also have now within the new Enscape predefined Enscape material libraries, which is great. So we can look at lots of different materials as well as creating our own materials, and I'll show you how to use that. Another cool thing in Enscape is we've got a nice asset library, so there's lots of different types of assets which we can then bring into our Rhino models and render, and it's great for things like vegetation in particular scenes that you're rendering, which is good. So there's lots of different kind of trees and vegetation and making kind of people for scale, how big these things are, which is great. So those are those three. Then we've got the last three kind of buttons. We've got a button that synchronizes our Enscape camera position with the Rhino camera position. So every time you move in Rhino, it'll move in Enscape. We've got a live updates, so if I move, say, a model in Rhino, it'll update it in Enscape, which is good, so we can turn on and off that, and I'll show you why we use that. And then finally, we've got our Start Enscape in a separate video button, and that's how we launch our Enscape user interface to render. So I'm going to now start this by clicking on it, and it's going to start Enscape. And this will really depend on how long it takes, will depend on how heavy your file is. but the file that we're using is in 2 so we should be able to quite quickly, hopefully. So immediately in the scene we can see some of the models that we have. So just to recap, this synchronize if I turn this on, this will synchronize the view with Rhino. This live updates will, as I move, will move as well. So the live update is good if you're kind of working away and you're rendering it. Want to view this in rendering at the same time in real time. Sometimes you might have this off, model, and then turn it back on. It just, if you're keeping it on and you're modeling at the same time, it's obviously going to slow your computer down. The live camera position is good if you're trying to get a view within Rhino. Sometimes it can be a bit hard navigating Enscape to get the particular view, so this kind of helps also in having that switched on. So we're going to look at now the user interface in Enscape, which is this viewport. So there's a couple things that we have. I'm going to first start from the top right here. There's this kind of help panel, and this is good because if you're ever in doubt, it's going to just show you the basic controls of Enscape. So we've got, as if you're kind of playing a game, the WASD, which control. Also got E and Q, which move up and down. Then WASD. We can also left click and move, and that will look around. And we can right click, that will orbit, and then mouse click, holding your mouse down will pan. If we double click on an object in our Enscape, that will kind of zoom into it. And then can also change the time of day, so hold shift down and right click with our mouse from left to right, and that will change the sun time of day. So you'll notice in the bottom right hand corner it's giving the time and that you're changing it to the lights in shadow. It's also changing. Then we've got a few others. So if we hold down shift, that will move faster. If we hold down control, that will also move faster as the panning already. Got stuff like standard views, so 8, 4, 5, 6, 2. They kind of give you that kind of 4 viewports of back, front, elevation, etc. Then we've also got U and I, which will also change the time of day. And then if we hold shift and U and I, that will change the solar angle. Hold control U and I, that will change the solar rotation. And then if we just press home, that will reset everything. So that's the basics kind of how to get around Enscape. So if you're ever in doubt, forgetting, it's always great to just click that help panel. Next thing we're going to look at is this kind of render window settings. So this just basically more controls the user interface of Enscape. So we've got things like mouse speed, mouse movement, the height that you're spectating, width, those kinds of things. You can also set a screenshot hotkey. So I press Shift F11, it's going to render the image. Then we've got stuff like VR headset. I'm not going too much into that today in this tutorial because I'm not really looking at it too much. we've got then this box, we can change the perspective to point or orthographic, so that's good. Then we've also got a save frame button, which limits the visible area. For render, got a map to show you. If you click this on, that will show you where exactly in the model are. So sometimes that's good if you have a large model, there's lots of things in your model and you're not quite sure where exactly you are. Then we can export objects. We've got panorama modes, so that will export different panoramas. I'm not going to go into too much panoramic rendering today, it's going to be more just classical renders, setting that up. Then we've got this button here, which is basically our creating a render. So if you click that, it's going to render our image. We can also do videos. That will be for a later tutorial, but Enscape can also render out videos based on particular paths. So we can set up paths of video and then it'll render. We can also look at particular asset libraries. That's cool. Select some assets. Okay, we'll go through this. So that's that asset. Then we've got view management, so we can create views. So we can say a view like this, call it one. It's going to come up. Also say name views in here. So Rhino, and it'll also come up Enscape as well, which is nice to have. So you can kind of create views in Rhino as well as Enscape. Then we've got beamed information. That's a bit less relevant. TM, collaborative annotations, so you can annotate this within, say, render, and then share it, and then we've just got a home, which takes us back to home. So those are those settings, and then finally the main setting that you'll be using is then the visual settings within Enscape. So that's this kind of eye settings here. So if we click this basically gives us all the kind of main settings that for the Enscape environment. So things like style, so we can control outlines of our objects. We can have all objects as white, terrestrial, or light view, so we can, which is nice, we can see how much light is actually penetrating. Towers based on also time of day, so see painting a shift. Sun is going to change the lux light, the amount of light that's coming to these towers. And then we've also got things like projection, so we can also change the camera angle in here to our orthographic 2-point and perspective. Within the perspectives and 2 points, you've got things like exposure, field of view, and depth of field, which you can play with as well. So you can see how the field where I'm looking at this kind of this tower in the foreground, and then in the background I'm blurring out that's tower. So that's something to also they also do have auto buttons for auto explosion and focal points, so we adjust that as well. So if we turn off autofocus, we can adjust where the focus is and the distance, and it's showing us, if you see here, that it's kind of highlighted geometries where the focal point is in the model. We then also have rendering quality, so draft, medium, high, ultra, depending on when you're kind of at what stage you are in rendering process. If you have it on ultra, obviously it's gonna render basically what the render output will be, and that if your model is getting very slow, that can slow it down. So depending on how much you have in your 3D model, you may also want to change it to medium draft, so you can see the difference. As medium, the quality is not as good, and then go to draft, it's obviously more draft. So we're kind of just looking at the basic kind of elements within the model. So it can be good to alternate between, depending on how your workflow is. For this, I'm just going to have it on as ultra because the components aren't too heavy. But when it does get heavier with assets and trees and stuff like that, you might want to adjust it. So that's the main kind of environment. The next thing we have is image. So we change things like highlights, shadows, saturation, color temperatures, same as if you have them in Photoshop. We've got things like motion blur, so you can see it to the blur background, particular lens flares, sky, blue, to vignettes. So those are things you can also then we have things like atmosphere, so we can do things such as fog, the height of the fog, and then we can also control the sun brightness. So bright it's going to get. It's like night sky brightness, so something night. So it's the brightness of the night sky is a lot higher, whereas if I turn to it's going to get darker. So that's kind of also something you can play with. Then we also have particular things around shadow sharpness, artificial brightness, and ambient brightness, as well as wind intensity and direction. We've also got assets for skies. So you can click this white background off, you'll see by default Enscape has a sky, and we can do things like put particular sky boxes in, such as deserts, mountains, etc. Generally, I'm not massive user of these sky boxes. You can look for your own sky boxes or create your own sky boxes, but generally it also works well when you have your own 3D model site. And you can see the skybox will also impact materials and as well of your 3D models. clear. Then in terms of the cloud section, we've got things like density. So if I increase the density, you'll see the clouds go overcast, different varieties. The cirrus, which is more smaller grain, particular things like contrails. And then we can also change the longitude and latitude of sky. For this tutorial, I'm just going to work off a white background, so if you ever just want a white background. So it can be good, the white background, just to, for diagramming, kind of tower this manner where you're just kind of trying to look at the geometry model or then beyond side of clouds and stuff like that. So we're going to just focus on this. And then finally, we've got an output tab. So this basically all the settings for your render output. So you've got things like resolution, change the 1024, HD, Full HD, etc. And then we've got a custom option where we can input our own aspect ratios. We've got options to export the material ID, object ID, depth channels, and then how much depth it's capturing, and then also the file formats of JPEG, etc. And then we've got a default folder where our renders will be saved. So if we click on this folder, we can say navigate, and I'll create a new folder. Renders, and select folder. So let's change, so all our renders are going to be set there. Then we've also got settings for videos and panoramas, outputs as well, which I'll go into what those do tutorial. So that's kind of the main settings around the interface of Enscape. So now what we're going to look at is kind of how do you set up some materialities, Rhino, place some assets, as well as how you might populate assets beyond just placing them manually. Grasshopper as well. And we'll also look at importing predefined assets and tuning materials, etc., as well as kind of clipping planes and how you might do rendered sections within Enscape. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to look at creating our own material. So you'll see in this 3D model I've got 3 different towers, and they all have this kind of, obviously, they're all broken down into their different elements. Just like everything, it's really important that the layer structure is organized so that you can apply materials. So to create an Enscape material from scratch, what you need to do is we go to our layers tab, then go to materials, then we press this cross button, then at the bottom you'll have an Enscape option. So we'll click Enscape and we're going to create a wood CLT material. So then what you'll do, instead of normal way where you've kind of got all these settings in Rhino, you can navigate to this circle, sphere, checkered, tune materials option, and you'll see So when we open this up, you'll see that we've got our Enscape materials that we've created. So that CLT timber material that we've created is now here. And what we're going to do is we've got a couple options. So we've got a type, things like grass, water, lights, carpet, that kind of stuff. And then we've got a couple settings here, which is stuff like albedo, bump maps, reflections, and transparency. So the first thing you might want to do is look for kind of CLT timber textures if you're creating your own. And obviously you're going to want to look at how you might Photoshop them, or choosing particular scales that also work, and resolution of images is important in this process. So say you found this particular material, and I'm going to save this here. Timber material CLT timber. So we'll go back into Rhino, and then we'll find that texture. And then, so we've got this now, so I'm going to open up Enscape. And so what you want to do is you want to select obviously all your materials, objects that you want to apply this material to. So what I'm going to do is, because they're all the same color, I'm going to cell color, and I right click on CLT timber and assign to objects. So now when I load up Enscape again, it's going to have materials applied to it. So you can see here, materials applied. So one of the things that you'll notice is like I'm not quite happy with how the material is applied. So you see the scale of the material is obviously quite wrong. So one thing I'll do is I'll go again and I'll go cell color. In this case, I'm going to go texture mapping, and I'll go apply box map. I'm going to change the way the scale material is mapped to its objects. So I'm going to start with a 3 meter by 3 meter by 1 meter box. See how that changes, and so you can see now that's probably a better, more appropriate scale. So that's one thing that's very important, making sure that you're mapping the scale correct. Next thing is, if we go back into this material editor, you can also do things like have a bump map. So if I zoom in here, see. We can start to give this a bit of texture where it looks a bit kind of three-dimensional. So that's something also you can play with. In terms of reflection, for stuff like wood, you probably don't too much reflection because it's going to make it very metallic. So I would probably advise not doing that, but we'll go into that more with glazing and stuff like that, as well as transparency. So I've got like a very basic wood texture now that I'm kind of interested in. Another option is, what we can do is we can go to can look at these material library as well. So we've got particular options. Also look at wood, and it's got various different types of wood, such as chipboard and these kind of things. I mean, these ones generally are very kind of floor orientated materials, so you're going to want to be careful in how you map these. Obviously, doing it more globally. We might use one for glass. So I'm going to say frosted glass, and so we'll just click this and go import select. So now we should have a frosted glass material. So what I'm going to do is I want to apply these all to a particular layout, glazing. So just these, so I'm going to apply that. And we're going to look at this. So now you can see it's completely changed, but I might want to say adjust the color. So you can see these are they're quite textural, one. So I want to bump that down, and I want to change the color. So let's go into the tune materials. Let's just and we're going to go to the frosted. So first thing is maybe I want to change it to that green. So let's start to the right. So let's go to the elevator. Let's go. Just this kind of spec. Fraction. Let's change the tint color so it's a bit more kind of deep. So I kind of want to imply in this one, maybe not so much glass, but I'm going to apply more of this kind of idea of green zone space as this kind of glaze element. And I might change this intensity so you can see this height map is very intense. So I'm just going to pare that down again, just so it's a bit less intense. Fraction. Let's change the color to be. So that's one way as well. You start to change the materiality of Enscape's preset material as well. So you'll notice here I've got kind of a glazing element as well that has a purple glass, and then I've also just got within Rhino material clear green. And that's probably better. So Rhino materials will also work with Enscape as well. So next, let's also change this one. So color. Let's apply the frosted. So one thing is you're going to want to make sure that if you're dealing with meshes, that kind of normal of the mesh is facing outwards. So if you go flip normal, it's going to flip the direction up. So now if I material on it, just flip that again. So that's one thing we want to just keep in mind. So these are planes as well. So that's generally how you kind of tune materials. It's much similar to the way you would do it in V-Ray or any other tools. So the next thing we'll look at once you kind of have a tuned material is how you might add assets into Enscape. So using this asset library within the rendering interface, if we navigate to this button, what we can do is we can say, let's say we want to start placing some bushes and stuff like that. We can search for bushes in the asset library, and then we can select lots of different assets, and then we have a couple options of how we might add these assets. So we can do it square, where we draw kind of like a square, got a circle, draw a circle, so like that. Regenerate, confirm placement. It's gonna change it, so it's gonna zoom. It's going to apply those vegetations to that geometry, so you can see there. So I'll give it a scar placement. So we can draw a circle. Now let's say this blue. Go regenerate, confirm placement. It's going to apply these to the model, and obviously because it's getting a bit big now, it's going to take a bit of time. So it's starting to put that geometry on the top faces of this, which is quite nice. So we can keep loading this up and adding more kind of vegetation to this, which is great. And so if I let's say let's do a tower. And we can also, change the density of it, so you can see the high density. And then we can change the distribution, so jitter for random, so jitter for this one. Also randomize the rotation. And obviously the more kind of vegetation you have, the kind of more dense it's going to be. So and then we'll go regenerate. So that's going to generate it, firm placement, and then apply changes. And it is just going to just apply it to your 3D model, which is pretty good because it enables kind of you to quickly distribute these assets onto 3D models so you can get a nice idea of particular vegetation. So obviously I'm just kind of picking vegetation at random. You want to kind of curate the ones that you choose a bit more carefully. So I probably would advise that it's kind of cylinder one, so it's kind of teardropped tree shapes, small shrub, stuff like that. But I mean, with anything, it's kind of one of those things where you want to design um, the vegetation. So as I said, it's going to take time, depending on how many assets you have, obviously, and how big your kind of radius is of geometry. So that's done now. We can see if I zoom in, obviously this isn't quite ideal in terms of placement, but it just shows you how it's kind of within that kind of asset library way. So another way we can also do it. So you'll see now as well, it's populating all these kind of assets. So what you could also do is start to copy manually, put these assets in to your tower. So I mean, there's a kind of combination of ways you can do this. Another way we can also load assets is through this Enscape asset library, where we can basically look at kind of different assets. So let's say bush so we select this kind of glass one. What it's going to ask for is a target surface. It's going to ask for a target surface and then point to place. So you can see that it's quite a small asset, so just have to place that, and then manually also place that asset. So particular furnitures or something. And I mean, I'll say this now with the furnitures and stuff like that. With everything, it needs to be designed. It's not something just random. Pick a furniture. It needs to be kind of fit building. So, chair. Outdoor terrace, for instance. So this would probably be when you're more looking at the kind of zoomed in scale of towers rather than say so far out. So I would advise just more say sticking to vegetation and stuff. Another way we can also do it is if I say delete it. We can also do it within Grasshopper. Where we use the plugin Elephant to load in these blocks, and then you can come up with particular ways you might input points for where it's might map these kind of particular assets within the tower. So I'm going to use so I'm going to input that into Grasshopper. And then what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to say, well, maybe I want to have, I don't know, this kind of just populate some of these geometries. So that would be one way, and then you have these kind of points. These green. So I've got all these kind of points now. So then maybe I'll just say there's 50 points thing, and then what we can do is we can go into our asset manager. Select our, say, vegetation that we might like. So it's this one. It's quite small. And then within Elephant plugin, we can reference in blocks. So let's get these made. And I'm just going to make sure we've got one block, so you can see all those other blocks that we're doing. So you just need to make sure one thing is that, within your block manager, you want to just make sure that you've got one block that you're using. Can get a bit convoluted, so you add lots of blocks. So we've got our block name, which comes from reference block by name component, as well as the insert block document. So what that will do is that will basically get you the block geometry. So we've got our block geometry. So then the next thing we want to do is basically what we can do is we can move all these blocks. We can say move point, get our geometry, we can define a point, so say we want the point to be the center of the asset. A. So then you'll see we've now got all these kind of like assets, and then all we need to do is we can just make these assets. We can make objects, geometry. Let's just put a tree, make that to a tree layer. So and we'll click bake, and then once that bakes, there we have it. So we've got all this kind of assets on our model. So that's another way you can add assets. So there's kind of three ways: doing it manually, doing it through this kind of asset library tool, Swatch, which is similar to rendering software like Twinmotion and stuff like that, where you can paint basically the assets, or through Grasshopper. So then the final thing that I'll show you is how we also do clipping planes. And how clipping planes can be used to render kind of sections. So Enscape's also good because we can see live the clipping planes based with in Rhino. We can see live basically in Enscape the clipping plane geometry. So this is an instance where I might just not have the live sync on yet. Geometry. This section. So now we can see basically that's kind of in Enscape, that's kind of plain. So this is also a nice way to understand the tower sectionally, the rendering it as well, so you can see how it's cutting through. And then you might also like say go back to these controls, the 4, 5, 1, 2 examples. Now we can see that's the section I start to instance bump up the outline with so see section polygons of this. So then all that's left is kind of rendering. So to render, we just click this screenshot, and it's going to render basically our files and save, save it. So, so it's pretty quick in terms of like how it renders. So, and then finally, one thing is in terms of your settings, what we can also do is you'll see this triangle part here. We can save our settings, so we can go create preset 001, 002, and then we can export these presets out to share with, say, our team members and save as file to import. So that's a kind of bare basics tutorial on Enscape and how to use it. In later tutorials, I'll go into more detail about videos